Pause the video, give this a go, and then I'm going to show you a solution. Oh, when I say give this a go, I would like to do first row set, and this needs to be done in pseudocode. Good luck! Okay, so I'm hoping you've given this a go yourself. First, let's have a look at the problem itself. A mobile phone has a touchscreen. The touchscreen is represented by a grid, so this is my phone, we've got a grid, blah, 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 just like this. 800 rows, so I'm going to do 1 to 800, and 1,280 columns, so 1 to 1,280 columns. So basically it's this, which I've just drawn visually. So 1,280, 800 down here. The grid is represented as a 2D array called screen of type integer. So each one of these is going to be a number inside of it. Cool. An array element will be set to 0 unless the user touches the screen. So by default, every single thing in here will be at 0. Then the user will touch the screen. Fine, I've got my head around that. Many array elements will set to 1 by a single touch. So if I touch it, it turns to 1. The following diagram shows a simplified touch screen. The dark line represents a touch. Aha! So this is a touch. But all grid elements that are wholly or partly inside the outline will also be set to 1. Got it. So this is going to be a 1, this is going to be a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1. So this is like the finger. What a drawing. The element shaded in black represents the center point of the touch. Okay, so the touch is here. The dark line represents the finger. Got it. A program is needed to find the coordinates for row and column, so we need to find the coordinates of the center point, so i.e. this. So this would be 11.6 or 6.11. Assume the user may only touch one area at a time. Screen rotation does not affect. So, okay, great. The program has decided to use global values. So we've got two values, center row and center column, which are in the main code because they're global variables. So, interesting. For the center point. The program has started to define the modules below. Okay, so we've got first row set, last row set, first col set, last col set. Right, so the one I asked you to do was this one in pseudocode. So searches for the first row that has an array element set to 1. So what we want to do is it needs to go through each row and then each column, then second one, third one, until we find a 1. So let's imagine that this is going to be a 1 here. And it then returns the index of that row. So we don't need the row and column, we just need the row to be returned. Fine. However, if there's no 1 in here, in the whole thing, so all of these are 0, it'll return -1. So we know that we're returning an integer. Okay, it doesn't mention anything about data being passed into this function, which makes me then assume that whilst this is global values, we don't have anything which is stored in the local row. So what we need to do is keep track of the row and the column each time. And once we find something, we want to stop. Otherwise, we just carry on. Makes sense. Now, normally we would use, to go for a 2D array, a for loop. In fact, 2 for loops. One to go through the row and the other to go through the column. However, the example doesn't like us using break, which is what we would have to use in our for loop. Well, I suppose we can just do a return when it's found. Okay, let me show you two different ways you can do this. One using the for loops, and one using, we don't need break, while loop. Both methods, I'm going to show you, will hopefully work. Okay. Let me just pause the video and clear up the screen. So to begin with, let's do our function header. So let's do function first row set. We're not passing in anything, but we are going to return an integer. My array is 1280 rows, sorry, columns, and 800 rows. So if we just do 800 by 1280. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to use a while loop to begin with to go through each one of these. Now, in order for us to do this, I need to basically, let me just move this further down. I'm going to leave space up here on purpose because I will be declaring things before this. So whilst our row is less than or equal to 800, so we're going to be forcing it to go down by 1 each time until we get to 800. And found equals false. So again, there are different ways we can do this. I'm going to try and show you each way. Which means in pseudocode we need to say, obviously, that row is going to equal to 1 to begin with. That's where we're starting. We're starting on row 1, so we're starting here. Now what we want to do is do the inner loop, which is going to basically go through each column. So while, I'm going to call it col for column, is less than or equal to 1280 and found equals false. Which means I need to declare column as 1, and I'm putting it inside this loop, so that it has a chance to keep going up by 1 every time we start a new row. Or let me rephrase that, when we start a new row, so it starts again on 1. So what we'll have is row, column. Once it's done all the columns, blah 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 blah, it'll move on to the next row, and then we want it to start again on 1, checking this column this time. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to check to see inside the 2D array whether or not it matches 1. So that's easy. So if screen, and remember in a 2D array you don't need 2 different square brackets, we just put it into 1 in pseudocode. So we've got a row and we've got a col equals 1. Then, so if there's a match, again I'm going to be showing you different ways we can do this. So if there is a match, what we want to do is we want to set found to become true, which means it stops for loops. And if and then what we want to do is row equals row plus 1. I think I've actually missed something, so my bad. Let me think this through. We need to increment the column first, so it's end if, and then column goes up by 1. Which makes sense. If it's not matching, we want the column to go to the next column. So if it doesn't match here, we want a column to go to there. And then go to end the while loop. And then what we want to do is, if none of this matches, So I didn't mean to zoom out there. So if none of this matches, we need row to go up by 1. So I'm going to do outside of the while loop, row equals row plus 1. So outside of this while loop. Let me just undo that scribble. Okay. So row equals row plus 1. Nice and simple. Okay, and then let's end the while loop. So the outer while loop. And then what we're going to do is check our flag at the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do if flag equals false, return -1. Else. Now, what we need to do is make sure that we store the row we found it on. So I need to add another variable, and I'm going to call it like pos for position. And I'm going to set it to be screen. In fact, I don't need to do screen row, I just need to do, let me just undo that. I'm going to set it to be the current row. So else return the row with, sorry, not row, pos. Why isn't this undoing? So we're returning pos, which will store the row we found it on. So if it equals blah 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 blah, found equals true, and row becomes pos, so we're returning the row we find it on. And if and then end function. Now that's actually an easier way of doing this. If we wanted to use a while loop still, we can get rid of our flags. We can get rid of all of this stuff. You know what? Why don't I just use the eraser? 1 minute. And well, okay. So all we need to do really is do this. Once we find it, so there's a 1 on the grid, found, we can just simply return row, which straight away finishes all of this. It breaks the loop, and we're back into the main code again. Otherwise, we're going to, at the bottom, return -1 and then end function. And that, again, will work fine. So this is basically saying it will only return row when we found a row. Otherwise, if we've gone through a whole loop and we haven't found any ones at all, so all zeros, it'll get to here, return -1, we're done. You could also do this as a for loop. I'm not going to baby you and how to do a for loop in pseudocode. You just loop through to 800 and loop through to 1280. That is fine. That will work. My final bit of advice, well, the final thing we need to do is declare our variables. I'm going to do that as hashtags. So we've got row. So I'm going to write declare row col as integer or dot integer. And in my old code, I had pos to declare pos. Let's just put pos as well on here. Pos as integer. And that, folks, is a wrap for that part of the question. Okay, pause the video, give this a go. Part A was what you've just done. So this is B, based on the code you made. All right. so this says describe a feature of our solution. So a feature, a thing we did. That indicates the pseudocode which we used makes it efficient. So it's basically asking, let's imagine we had 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 800 by 1280. We could have programmed it so it just did this. Checks this, checks this, checks this, checks this, checks this, checks this on this row, then go to this row, check this, check this, check this, check this, check this, check this, check this. Remember, we find it here, but we still continue. Check this, check this, check this. This would work. And then we can just return that value at the end. But the problem is it's inefficient. We didn't need to do any of this because we found it here. So what did we do in our code which says, let's stop now, we found it? If you used a flag that broke the while loop condition, and then returned the position of row, that's one answer. If you didn't use a flag and you did it straight away return, you can just say, I immediately returned the row when found a 1 in the if statement, breaking the loop and finishing the function or ending. That's if you did it using return and not a flag. There you go, nice and easy, 2 marks. Pause the video, give this a go first yourself and for both bits of the question, and then I'm going to do a solution with you guys. Okay, so the question's kind of asking us to make some changes to the code. The program decides to produce one search module. So we've got at the moment one search to search for the first row, one to search for the last row, as in searches for the last row that has an array element set to 1. First column set, last column set. So each one has a different purpose because what it's trying to generate is, if you remember on the touch screen, you've got the point and then you've got like a border around it. So each search here is searching for something different. So it's basically creating, if we used this search, it's looking for the first one like here. If you're using this one, it's like searching for this bit because it's at the border. If you're using the first column set, again it will find this one. Last column set, again it'll find this one. But if we had, let me just use the actual image itself. Boom, 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 boom. And there we go. Let's imagine we're using first row set. It'll check this row, it'll check this row, it'll check this row, it'll go through the columns obviously, and it finds it here. So this is our first one here. That's fine. Last row set, it'll check all the rows, and it'll go to the final one. I'll identify that this is the last row. So it's the first row here. So it's like row number 3, and this is like row number 9. So that's what's being returned. First column set is looking for the first column. So boom, 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 we go along 3, and it's actually going to be here, which is our first column. We find it on 5. So this is what's going to be returned. This column here. Whilst the last column set, we'll find the final column, which is this column. So each search is going to be slightly different in terms of how it's going to operate. But what it's asking us to do is to convert. So the program decides to produce a single search module, so one search, which will be able to perform each of individual searches. So it should one function, which will have the capabilities to do this, 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 and this. What would you need to do in order to allow this to happen? What would you do? How would you program it so that it was able to do this? So that it can perform what we need? Well, step one, if we're making this new function, and let's call it function search, actually it's called find set. You don't need to do what I'm doing right now, I'm just planning this out. We need to determine what the user wants to do. So in the main code, they're going to want to have to select one of these. So we need to be passed in a parameter. So let's imagine we had search equals input. What do you want to do? I'm just going to call it what. And then we call find set, and I put in search. So we type in, I want the first row set, or I want the last row set, or the first column set, last column set. So step one is we pass in parameter of what we want to search for, or the type of search. And then maybe give an example. Really simple. Now, what we don't want is, in all honesty, loads and loads and loads and loads of code. We want to simplify things. A lot of this code is going to be very similar. The only difference is when it stops. So what we also want to do is pass in a parameter to control the algorithm when to stop. Again, these are going to be very similar pieces of code. Because they're very similar, the only difference is when it's going to break. In this case, it's going to break when we get to the first row, when we find a 1. This one is the first column, sorry, the last row, when we have a 1. First column, last column. Therefore, if we're using a loop, we could use one loop, but the conditions could be set to variables, which we pass in. So that way, the loop will keep running, but it's dependent upon what we pass in with our search. So we'll be passing in two parameters. One which is our search, and one which is going to be our parameter controller. That is one way of doing this. Another way what we can do this is to actually, we have individual searches inside one function, one module, and use a case or if statement to select the one we want and return results. So I'm basically saying it's a huge function which has each one of these as like an if. Unless it's not efficient, it will still work. The second part to this question, give one possible advantage and disadvantage of combining 4 searches into one module. Well, one advantage is if change to specification or requirements we put requirements, as in, if they want a change in how it works, let's imagine that instead of it being a 1, it's going to be a 2. We only need to change one place in the code. Like the same with any time we talk about the advantages of using functions and procedures. We put it into one place, easier to change. If we do this properly, another advantage is that we have fewer lines of repeated code. I've already talked about how we can make the algorithms a bit more efficient by using a variable which basically controls when we stop, which is going to be different for each one based on the parameter passed in. So we have fewer lines of repeated code. Again, this is the same advantage every time we talk about advantages of procedures and functions. Less lines of repeated code. If we want to make a change, it's in one place. But also, another advantage which you can use every single time within this is allows code to be reused. By using functional procedures, we can combine it into one. It increases reusability. Let's say it increases reusability. Sorry about my messy handwriting. In terms of disadvantages, let me just wipe clean the advantages. What would be the disadvantages of putting everything into one massive function? Well, one disadvantage would be more complex than having several functions, which could lead to errors, but also harder to debug. And another problem is, another advantage of normal procedures and functions is you split into different modules and different people, so person A, person B, person C can work on it. But if we put it all into one single module, cannot be split amongst a team or teams. So it's kind of talking about advantages of using functions versus normal programming without procedural programming, so you just don't use any functional procedures. By putting it into one function, everything, it kind of is like turning it from modular-based programming, where you've got a function A, function B, function C, into just giant one. But then it's harder when it comes to people working together, and it's also harder to spot where the mistakes are. If you've got all of these different things happening, it's hard to spot where the actual logical mistake is. But actually, if you had it split up, you would know that every time you use last row set, that's where the problem is. So you can go straight to that module and fix it. Okay, this information at the top isn't really that relevant. I just put it there so you can visually see the whole thing in action. This at the bottom is important. Let me just, can I put this so it goes to the top? Yeah, bring to front, there you go. Pause the video and give this a go. Okay, so we know that we're dealing with a procedure and not a function because there's no return. And what we want to do is calculate this middle point here. To calculate the first to middle point is asking us to use the 4 modules. So it's asking us to use the 4 modules in here. So our procedure called get center, but no parameters being passed in. It mentions nothing about that. So that is it. And I know that I need to use at some stage first row set, last row set, first column set, and last column set. I need to use those inside of it. It's telling me to do that. Because I'm doing that, these are functions, there's going to be a result. Just do reverse. or in pseudocode, arrow. Okay. Cool beans. It assigns values to center row and center column, and set center row to -1 if no screen has been touched. Easy. Okay. So I can actually do the bottom bit first. It'll make sense. If nothing's been touched, so all of this is 0, there's no point doing everything else. Think about it logically. If nothing's been touched, finish. That's the first thing we can do. So I'm going to just erase this. And I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to call it start. And that is going to call first row set. So remember what first row set does. It goes through every single row to find a 1. When it finds a 1, it returns the row, otherwise it does -1. So if start, which remember will store whatever's been returned from first row set, equals -1, then it tells us set center row to be -1. There you go, done that bit already. So we're using first row set to check to see if there's -1 in here. Sorry, I'll rephrase that, to see if it returns a -1 or a row. If it returns a row, so let's imagine it's here, it will return row 6, so that's fine, this will be 6. So we'll use this later on. Now what we're going to do is an else. And we're going to now call the other variables, the other functions. So we're going to have end, that should be end, and we're going to call last row set. So we've got our start, we've got our end. It's then going to call our start column, which is first col set, and our end column. Last col set. So we've called all of this. But how do we calculate the middle? So how do we actually calculate this center point here? Well, we need to take our, if I just zoom in, oh my gosh, I did not mean to do that, I'm sorry. If I just zoom in, this is just basic math and some logic. We need to identify or take our first row, which actually won't be 6. I don't know why I put 6 beforehand, I apologize. Our first row would be 1, 2, 3. So we're going to take our first row, we're going to take our last row, which is 9. And then we need to find the middle between that, so we divide it by 2. So 12 divided by 2, so 9 plus 3 equals that, equals 6. So we found our row middle point. But then we take our column first, which would be 10, 9, 8, 7, 7. It'll then take our last column, 12, 13, 14, 15, equals 22. 22 divided by 2 equals 11. So we've calculated our middle points for both, and all we need to do now is assign those values to here. So how do we do that in programming terms? Well, that's quite easy. We're going to have our center row. To become our start row. Well, actually, it's just called start, isn't it? My apologies. Start plus end. We'll put that in brackets. So we add these two up first and divide it by 2. But we need to int it so that we have no possible remainders. So the int. So we've got int start plus end divided by 2. For a column, it'll be the same. Center col equals int start col plus end col divided by 2. End procedure, sorry, end diff and end procedure. So, just to recap, what we've done is we simply calculated the coordinates. The way we calculated coordinates is we had to use the 4 modules. We then had to work out how to get to the center row and center column. I used a visual to help me do that. The clues to say that we had to call these modules in the first place was it says uses the 4 modules. So we're using these modules we created earlier. Well, we actually only created theoretically this one earlier, but who cares? If we've got no ones in it, we set center row to become -1. I simply did that to begin with. Let's give it that 6 as well. So we called first row set, because we know that first row set goes for each row, check see if there's a -1. If there's a -1, it will return a -1. If it returns a -1, we can then use that in an if statement. So if start equals -1, -1 is the center row, boom. Otherwise, we call off different functions, we then do our 2 calculations, done. There's no return, there's no print. That's what it's doing.